Okay, so we are back. All right, so there is something called, we have you only have to file that PMN if it is, before you start manufacturing something. However, if there is something already on the TSCA list that you're allowed to use, but you are using it for something else, a significant new use that is under the significant new use rule, which is the old SNR. So the SNR says if it's determined that there's an existing chemical that's already on the TSCA inventory, but we're using it for something else, um, the EPA may require that you file a pre-manufacture notice for this significant new use. Um, so let me clear this out. Um, okay, so if you want to use this chemical for a significant new use, you have to give the EPA at least 90 days notice prior to using this in a new way, and that's called the significant new use notice. And it's the same kind of process as the PMN. So it's that they have that 90-day period to respond, and if they don't respond, they can, they're free to use that chemical in the new use without giving further new notice to the EPA. So they don't have to do that. What is it? The notice of commencement, the NOC. So to determine what is a significant new use, I guess I'll go back. They have to. The EPA has to consider what they call all relevant factors. So but they really call a significant new use anything that will result in either increased volume of production, any greater or different degree of exposure to employees or the humans or the environment, or if somehow the disposal method is different. The exemptions from is that a
Sorry, I was starting. Here I am.
okay, good. I just wanted to see if somebody had raised their hand because I couldn't see that from the screen. And any exemptions from this significant new use rule are the same as those for the PMN exemption that we went through a couple of slides ago. And then a lot of times after the EPA receives one of these SNURs or SNUNs, they usually kind of do the consent decree process to say like, okay, you can use it, but we're going to either limit the quantities or we're going to, somehow constrain, limit how it is used. So that is the significant new use rule. So it's kind of like a PMN, but the chemical is already out there. They're just using it for a different reason. All right, so we're in the world now where biotechnology is big. These genetically engineered microorganisms. So EPA started to regulate those in 1994. It's pretty new science, so trying to figure out who is responsible for it was kind of an issue. So the EPA opted to use their power under TSCA for this new type of technology because the risks associated with these microorganisms are similar to the risks from chemicals. So these microorganisms are now on the TSCA inventory. They are regulated as organisms classified in certain biological kingdoms. Any new microorganism would be one that's not already on the TSCA inventory, and that it results from some sort of deliberate combination of genetic material in different genera, which, sounds like science. So, that's hard for me. So there is a special kind of pre-manufacture notice required for these microorganisms, which is called a microbial commercial activities notice, an MCAN. And same thing, they have to be filed 90 days prior to the commercial manufacture or importing of this new microorganism, um, or prior to a significant new use of an existing one. And they, if within 90 days they've done nothing, then when you start to manufacture it, you have to do that notice of commencement, and then it'll be on the TSCA inventory. So that's microorganisms. So they're already right now, as of 1994, some of these microorganisms have been on the TSCA inventory, and the EPA just decided, like, hey, you know what, we're gonna regulate these things under the TSCA inventory. Where did I want to make sure I talk about this. I don't know if I don't know if I skipped this over, but remember how we had the two kinds of TSCA inventories? We had the main one and the confidential one. So again, I don't know if I reiterated this enough because now I'm blanking. But the one that's on that the master list, there are certain ones that they're proprietary intellectual property kind of chemicals. So that's why it's not available to the public, because the companies have a proprietary interest in keeping that information to themselves, at least until a patent expires or something along those lines. So that's why there's two separate lists. So that was a rewind, but I wanted to make sure that I made that clear. All right, so testing. As part of your PMN, as I said earlier, the manufacturers and processors have to submit testing information. Okay, so they have to, think about it, what exposure to this chemical, what are the effects on humans, the environment, etc. So are there risks of things like cancer, birth defects, mutations, I don't know, effects on, flora and fauna, all of that kind of stuff. So, plants and wildlife.
Genetic mutations, what does that mean?
Well, I mean, think about, what's that one called? There was I remember there was that morning, what is it called? DES? You might remember this, Matt, but like in the 50s and the 60s, there was this morning sickness drug that was given out to women, and then some of the children were born with
birth defects.
Birth defects, yeah. The which was interesting in that one. I actually worked for I had a couple of cases on this representing the drug manufacturer. But the birth defects were related and mostly on the female baby's side, but it was about their own reproductive system. So this would be, 20, 30 years after, say, the mother took this drug, that they would realize that this woman, couldn't have kids or had, some reproductive defects, birth defects. So that was interesting with statutes of limitation and things like that. Whether can you go back and sue the drug manufacturer? So that was one big issue with those DES cases. The other one was there were a bunch of different drug manufacturers making it. So how could a woman who took a pill, 30 years ago, remember if it was made by Abbott or Pfizer or who the drug manufacturer was? So that was kind of a.
Margaret, do you remember when they used to advertise appetite suppressants and diet pills on TV?
Yeah.
Like Dexatrim and stuff?
Yeah.
Like made with like candy?
Yeah. And when, like ephedra. Remember ephedra? And then people started dying? I still when the things that are advertised, these drugs that are advertised on TV, I really think it's a bad idea. I really think that's something needs to I don't know why. I know they're allowed to do it, but I don't know why they're allowed to do it.
Well, that stuff looks less risky than rat poison.
Right? Oh, okay. So, so the testing requirements are supervised what's called the Interagency Testing Committee, the ITC. Um, so when and the TSCA gives the EPA authority to require more testing data if the EPA feels that a chemical may present somehow an unreasonable risk to humans, right? Um, I'm sorry. So this ITC was created to make recommendations to the EPA about chemicals, anything concerning deserving special consideration. So anything, as I said, carcinogenic, birth defects, genetic mutations, like people, being born with a tail, or you know, I don't know what the difference between birth defect and genetic mutation is medically, but I imagine there is. So I don't know what that is, but yeah, you would think of it as maybe it's somehow something alters the genes, and that would be a genetic mutation rather than some sort of failure to develop. I'm sorry, I don't have a medical or science background, so I can deal with the law. But anyway, if they identify one of those chemicals, they place it on the TSCA priority list. If it's identified by this interagency testing committee, um, and then it is identified by this interagency testing committee, and it's on the priority list, the EPA has to do something about it. And they're like, okay, we know that these chemicals have a risk. So within a year, the EPA has to do something about it. Either limit the manufacturer, ban the manufacturer, somehow have a warning, have, special handling requirements, whatever it is. And if not, they don't do that within 12 months. They have to have a valid explanation as to why they did not do that. So the ITC, their criteria for identifying these priority chemicals um, are things like the quantity manufactured, like how much of this chemical is being introduced into the environment, how much humans are being exposed, whether somehow this substance is similar to like another chemical that is known to be harmful, say it's similar in chemical composition to, say, PCBs, whatever data that they have concerning the effects of the chemical, and whether or not they have to, do some testing to assist in figuring out what the risks are. Okay, so if there are any chemicals on the priority list, there is an additional reporting requirement. So they call that the Preliminary Assessment Information Rule, PAIR. That one actually is a good acronym. So manufacturers have to submit, how much they're producing and the exposure data. So like who is being exposed, either, employees or the world at large. And then they might issue what we call test rules. So testing rules. So what kind of testing do you have to do on these chemicals on this priority list? Okay, so there's two different kinds of rules. So there's risk-based. So the EPA has to figure out what are the risks of the use of this chemical. We don't know if this chemical poses some sort of risk to humans or the environment. What we have out here right now isn't enough. And we have to have data to figure out what the potential are risks. If all of those things are, are present. Like, yes, it does pose an unreasonable risk, and we have inadequate data, and we need more testing. Um, we call that, then that means there is a risk trigger, and the EPA is allowed to require the manufacturers to submit testing data. Um, the other one is exposure based. So if we have a chemical that's produced in substantial quantities, and somehow it's expected to be released into the environment in substantial quantities, and we don't have enough data to see what's going to happen, they need to do some testing to obtain data to analyze potential risk. So if we're going to do, like, crop dusting with a new pesticide, right? So this chemical is going to be produced in substantial quantities and released into the environment. But we don't know what's going to happen when that happens. So we know that it's going, if things are on this same trajectory, a lot of people are going to be exposed to it. Well, then, holy cow, maybe we should do some testing before they're exposed to it to make sure that there isn't risk. So in that one, we don't have like support that it's bad, but we just know that a lot of people are going to be exposed to it. So we should test before the people are exposed to it. So that's the exposure based one. And then the other one is if we kind of think that this chemical might be bad news and propose a risk, then then we do the risk trigger, and then testing is required. So under the risk trigger, the EPA has to have a reason to make a finding that the chemical presents an unreasonable risk. So we need a more than theoretical probability. And the exposure trigger is that, like, we really don't have information that something's bad is going to happen, but we know that people are going to be exposed to it. So we should, before that happens, do some testing. Okay, so if one of these triggers is met, either the exposure trigger or the risk trigger, then the EPA publishes what we call a test rule for that substance, which it's a rule in the Code of Federal Regulations that says this substance, the people who are manufacturing it must test. Test for harm to humans or the environment. And courts have upheld these. For example, in Chemical Manufacturers Association versus EPA, which is in 1988, the court, upheld these risk trigger, these testing requirements. So that's all good. Exemptions to the test rules, so that you don't have to conduct this testing, and companies don't want to conduct the testing; it's expensive. And if something bad comes out, maybe they don't want to know about it, because then they'll have some sort of, if it goes to court, they're like, well, you knew that this bad thing could happen because you did this testing, right? So maybe they don't want to know. But which is why companies challenge this requirement for testing. But the exemptions to having to comply with these test rules are similar to what we talked about earlier, right? Like that LVE, the low volume exception. So if you're only producing a small amount, or say there's a substance that you're required to do testing for, but it's pretty much similar to another substance where they've already done this testing. So like, well, can't we just use the testing on, bleach A because I'm bleach B? But in that situation, say I'm exempted from doing my own testing, I have to then contribute money to those other companies if you're using their test data. If you don't kick it in, EPA can actually go in and issue an order requiring you to reimburse that company for their testing costs. These test rules are subject to judicial review, and there's no particular standing requirements on that. So like anybody can, if I look at these test rules, I could go in and say like these test rules, I'm challenging them. So there's no like particular standing requirement for this judicial rule of a testing. They call it a testing rule. I kind of think of it as a testing requirement, but it is a rule that requires testing related to the chemicals. Now, what do they do with the test data after they receive it? So if the test data demonstrates that the chemical or chemical substance gives them a reasonable basis to conclude that it will present a significant risk of serious or widespread harm to human beings from things like cancer, gene mutations, or birth defects, they must issue rules to somehow regulate the chemical, or have to announce in the Federal Register why they're not issuing regulations of this chemical. And if the EPA determines that a substantial risk exists, they have 180 days to determine whether it is going to, what it's going to do to regulate that substance. So they might require testing, they look at it. If it's a significant risk, they either have to regulate it somehow, limit it somehow, or tell you why they're not going to do that. Okay, record keeping. We talked about, like in the beginning of the class, that each category, manufacturers, disposers, users, whatever, have requirements related to record keeping. So the EPA uses any of the records that it has obtained under TSCA for a bunch of things, like decision making, any monitoring of activities, enforcement, right? So they're not just using it because, like, hey, you filed all these things, but they might go back and look at your TSCA filings to see if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, or they might even use it in enforcement of other environmental laws. So EPA is they're going to keep all the records. Now, if there is a significant adverse reaction, if you have an instance where a chemical causes a significant adverse reaction to either human health or the environment, these entities have to submit what we call a record of significant adverse reaction. Okay, and if it's to an employee, they have to keep these records for 30 years. For other people, 5 years. So a significant adverse reaction is defined as one that may indicate an impairment of normal activities or long-lasting or irreversible damage to health or the environment. So kinds of things that have to be reported are somehow animal or plant life. There's some change in the composition, right? So now all of a sudden the squirrels that are born are pink, the composition has changed. Abnormal numbers of deaths of organisms. Think about, like, sometimes they give a fish kill, right? Like all the fish are dying in a pond, or I don't know, something along those lines. If a species is significantly, their reproduction rate goes down, that's something that has to be reported. Or there's a species where the behavior, or where they then now nest or locate, has changed. So those are things that need to be reported as a significant adverse reaction. Okay, oh yeah, I talked about this. But if the testing shows significant risk, then they have to issue rules to regulate the substance or publish why it's not done so. If they have 180 days after the determination to figure out what they're going to do to regulate it. So maybe there are existing chemicals on the TSCA inventory, and if they figure out that these existing chemicals will present unreasonable risk to human health or environment, the EPA has to issue some rule making about those chemicals. So things that I mean, these are kind of things we would be familiar with, like asbestos, PCBs,
Asbestos,
metalworking.
yes.
Pardon?
Asbestos, yes. I think he had some pajamas made out of that.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah. My gosh, I was cleaning out my mother's attic. I'm sure, like, I have asbestos in my lungs from that. But PCBs, as we talk about, and they say metalworking fluids, that's kind of, a similar thing to PCBs. That they were like some sort of lubrication fluid in like giant machinery. Um, and then hexavalent chromium. Do you guys, anybody ever see Aaron Brockovich? In Aaron Brockovich, that was the big chemical that was causing illness in the community, hexavalent chromium. Um,
I saw Aaron Brockovich with Julia Roberts.
yeah, remember and she was a
Yeah.
paralegal. That's what I love
Yeah.
about that. Teaching, I think all of you guys, especially in my environmental law class, should see if you could watch that, because the fun thing about that is Aaron Brockovich was a paralegal, and she did all the digging. So like the attorney she was working for is like, oh, I've got like this settlement from, I can't remember the chemical manufacturer, from this chemical manufacturer. Why don't you look it over, get these things signed? And she was going through the community and realizing that all these people were sick, and why are, what's going on? And, there was a big class action, and it's kind of interesting. So that is the Aaron Brockovich case. And
Her
hexavalent.
negotiating skills to get herself a better job and a better benefits were pretty amazing too.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, she was great. It's a fun movie. It's and it really, again, for paralegals, she's there's not many movies where paralegals are the star. So you should look at that one. What's this one? What's this little article that I have posted? What surprise do I have in for us? Oh, okay. So out of our thousands, what did I say? 80,000 on the TSCA inventory. Let's see which ones are banned. Okay, the PCBs, and they've been long banned. Oh, the fully halogenated chlorofluoro. Oh, that's the aerosols, right? That were depleting the ozone layer. You youngsters probably don't even know about that, where like your hairspray was causing holes in the ozone. Dioxin, so that's like that's Agent Orange. So that was, so in Vietnam, they dropped like chemicals on like the jungles to kill the 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 plants and trees, so that the enemy couldn't hide in these jungles. So I guess this Agent Orange, they call that, and that was found to be carcinogenic. My father-in-law actually had Agent Orange exposure, and ended up, he was also a smoker, but he ended up with lung cancer. But it was partially supposed to be from Agent Orange, according to his disability. Okay, asbestos, we know about asbestos, right? Asbestos was like a fireproof chemical or fireproof um, substance that these fibers then get caught in your lung, and you get asbestosis and what is it, mesothelioma, which is pretty bad cancer. But a lot of people who worked in factories, a lot of military were exposed to asbestos. In 1989, asbestos was banned. Here's Aaron Brockovich with the hexavalent chromium, um, which was carcinogenic. Anything else? Those. That's just interesting. It's got, so like, if you know something's banned under TSCA, then you know that like it's pretty bad. Those things will kill you. Yeah, PCBs. Oh, coolant fluids. I thought it was. I don't know why I thought it was lubrication. Um, and the thing about the PCBs is that they don't uh, change or kind of break down. So they're still around, even though we haven't produced any in 1978. My gosh, it's all typos. But it's a known carcinogen and like super dangerous. So there's a whole page on the EPA website about PCBs. There it is. What are they? They're man-made. So they're in paints, pigments, and I do think they're also as lubrication. So I'm not gonna. There it is. Oil used in motors and hydraulic systems. So it's not just inks and things. Some oil-based paint, caulk, plastics have PCBs in them, and they're still around, even though nobody's made them since 1978. So we talked about in the beginning the rights that the EPA has, the right of inspection or subpoena right to against manufacturers, users, distributors, and disposers, right? So they can, any place that they want where any chemicals are manufactured, processed, stored, or held, they can inspect to make sure these chemicals are being properly handled. Um, there's no search warrant required, but they can say I have a constitutional right, which really nobody does, because if you're opposing an EPA inspection, then the EPA really thinks you're doing something bad. But usually it's not like, surprise, we're inspecting. They'll say we're going to inspect your facility, in 30 days or something along those lines. But they have the right to, and they do inspect facilities. Okay, so just like all of our other environmental statutes, it doesn't matter unless you can actually enforce them. So there are civil penalties for violating TSCA. If there are willful violations, there are more severe penalties. In severe cases of knowing or willful violation, there is an option to impose prison time or severe fines, and a citizen can bring an enforcement suit for TSCA. So things that they look at for the amount of the penalties, like what is the violation? Is it just like a misreporting, or is it purposeful? How long was it going on? How serious is it? What is the role of that individual in the violation? Does this company have a history of noncompliance? A lot of times when they're doing what we call punitive type damages to punish, they look at the financial situation of the company. So if it's a gazillion-dollar industry, giving them $100,000 fine doesn't mean anything. So they kind of maybe tailor the fine to how lucrative the company is, or the value of the company. They also can think of what interests of justice. So bottom line, the worse the behavior, the higher the penalty. The higher the amount that they would have to pay as a fine. Okay, in 2016, we have amendments, which are called the Frank R Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act. Look at that. That just rolls off your tongue. So, rather than just dealing with the pre-manufacturer notice, the 2016 amendments require the EPA to look at existing chemicals, starting with those most likely to cause risks to humans and the environment. It requires chemical assessments. It gives EPA the power to require some sort of development of chemical information, deadlines. But sometimes they put things out there and then the EPA takes its own sweet time. So there are clear and enforceable deadlines to make sure that there is review of these prioritized chemicals and action on risks. Um, we talked about the confidentiality of the TSCA inventory. So they're kind of policing what really is confidential and what is just kind of like, yeah, I don't want everybody to know about that. So they are limiting confidentiality claims and, kind of putting things more into the public domain so that, you can have policing by environmental groups or individuals. And health professionals to see if these chemicals are a risk. And more funding to the EPA to carry out these new responsibilities. Okay, so before, it was just kind of like that pre-manufacturer notice kind of thing, and we see what's going on. But now they're like, okay, we got to periodically review what's on the inventory, especially these high-risk kind of chemicals. So then there's more powers and more funding for that. So really what has changed, there were new rules finalized, based on those amendments. TSCA inventory was reset. The active chemicals are about 40,000. So kind of what is currently being manufactured, and then inactive chemicals that are not made anymore or not made anymore in large quantities. So then, okay, now they're only looking at these 40,000 versus 80,000. Okay, so that's a lot less work for them. They were talking, their pre-manufacturer notice, would there be fees required? So they have fee rules that help, pay for the implementation of TSCA. They did release one of this draft risk evaluation for 10 chemicals. And they identified the next set that they're going to be looking at. So they have 20 high priority chemicals that they're going to look at that get these full risk evaluations, and then there's 20 low priority chemicals that will get like some sort of assessment of those. So that is what is going on in TSCA. One of the things that prompted TSCA, or is like, we worry about this, does anybody remember Bhopal, the chemical release? I have a video. In India, it was terrible.
Chemical plant where they were digging the water wells and 90,000 people died?
Yeah, a bunch of, yeah, exactly. Where's the rest of this? Oh, there it is. So it's not going to be good if I want you guys to watch this video, and it's also going to, EPCRA, which we'll talk about in 2 weeks, is important for that, but it's a big video on like what happened in Bhopal and mistakes that were made and how dangerous it is when some of these chemicals get released. So for the rest, we have a discussion board on the Polaroid exemption. We have a new written assignment. Oh, I have a whole other thing to talk about. Annoying. All right, we're not done yet. One of the things that they like us to talk about in all of our classes is ethics. So we're going to be talking about writing when we're writing emails. So let's do that. That's fun. Let me go back. So this is just writing an ethical email based upon there's like 4 slides on what I'm talking about. But you guys, I'm sure, have learned about the big ethical issues as a paralegal that you have to deal with are: 1, you cannot let people think that you're a lawyer, because that is the unauthorized practice of law. The other big thing that you have to be concerned with is confidentiality of client information. I think those are kind of like the 2 big ones. And when you're writing emails at work, I really just like to open this and not be in here. Is it going to open for me? Come on, here it is. um, you have to worry about that when you're sending emails. So let me just do this quick little thingamabobber for you. Slideshow, current slide. Okay. Okay, yeah, so our primary ethical considerations, making sure that we are properly identifying ourselves as a position of, whatever your title is, paralegal, legal assistant, law clerk, legal secretary, right? You don't want anybody to ever think or assume that you're an attorney just because you work in a law firm. You can get in big trouble for that. The people you're working for can also get in big trouble for that. And then the other thing is confidentiality of client information. Those are primary considerations whenever you're doing any sort of correspondence in a law firm or law department. Secondary considerations when you're doing correspondence would be to maintain professionalism, and to be clear in your writing. So when you are different types of emails that you would be writing, I call these the CYA ones, cover your butt, because you may have a conversation with someone and you may hang up and they might have had a totally different understanding of what the conversation is, or a week later they will have a totally different memory of what occurred there. So do this all the time. Whenever you have a verbal conversation in a meeting or a telephone conversation, send a follow-up email. Thanks so much. I enjoyed talking to you. This is going to confirm that, we have a meeting on such and such a date, that we have a court date on such and such a date, that you agree to a certain settlement amount, whatever it is. It's good for you because then if that person, when they receive the email, has a different memory of the conversation, it will be then, up front and center, so then a further discussion can occur. Or somebody later on is saying what happened, you have a record of the activity, right? So someone else who is looking at the file can say like, oh, Jen Wan already sent an email on this. I don't have to worry about that. Okay, so just like some sample language, this is to confirm what we did. Thank you so much. Just some language. Letters, appointment letters or appointment emails. We might, like, to clients or to people that we work with, we have to tell people that there's a court date. We might have documents to send them. Everything, a phone call is really just not enough. We want to make sure anything that is going to be an appointment, we have the date, the time, the place, and the purpose. This letter is to notify you, or this note is to notify you of your need to appear on such and such a date in such and such a place. And for appointment correspondence, make sure that whoever you're sending it to, your client, your witness, that they confirm receipt. Let me know that you get this, because, and then calendar for yourself to remind them the day before. We all know, like, we have a doctor's appointment, it's on our calendar, but sometimes we don't remember until we get that phone call or that email or that text saying, hey, remember you have a doctor's appointment tomorrow at noon. You're like, oh yeah, crap, I forgot about that. But if you have a deposition and you have a court reporter and the opposing counsel and everybody's there and you were responsible for scheduling it and your witness doesn't show up, who's in trouble? It's not the witness, you're the one who's in trouble. Cover emails when you are sending documents of any kind. State specifically the documents enclosed. What does who's receiving it have to do with them? Is it for their records? Do they have to sign and return it? Do they have to review it? If there is an expected response, what is the date? And, for your own purposes, then I want you to calendar when you're supposed to get a response so you can follow up if you don't receive the response. Other thing too, when you're sending, make sure if you're sending documents, say you're like, there's a something that has been edited, You kind of have to scrub them to make sure that there's no like a document might have metadata with like former notes and things like that, when it's under different editing. So you might have the final one, but you could go back into editing mode and see people's edited edits from prior versions. And you got to be careful of that stuff because there might be confidential information in there. So watch what you're sending to whom, and watch to see if you're sending like a word or a word processing document, that there are no like hidden confidential information in there. That's like a super important thing on the confidentiality stand. Um, Information requests, be clear about what you're asking, be clear about when you need it by, and calendar that too in case you don't get it by the date you want it. Okay, so your emails should have a confidentiality statement in them. When you, in your signature line in your emails, make sure you always include, I am a paralegal, legal assistant, law clerk, whatever your title is. Don't just say, kind regards, Margaret. They don't know. That's not helpful for them. If they say Margaret from a law firm, they're going to assume I'm an attorney, even if I'm not. For confidentiality, never forward an email outside of your firm. So if you have any email that comes from anyone inside your firm and they're saying like, oh, send this attached thing to so and so, create a new email, because there might be an email string that you haven't fully looked through that contains some confidential information. So really be careful about forwarding. Always be professional. So even if you work with somebody all the time, for work emails that might end up discoverable or in a file, never include personal information with the professional information. Don't say like, hey dude, you were so wasted last night, BT dubs, here's that document you wanted. So you want to just, you text them or call them separately or email them separately, but anything with work in it, keep the personal out of it. We're all guilty of this, as I just looked at my PowerPoint, but like spelling and grammar counts, and not just to be persnickety about it, but if you don't spell things proper or there's improper grammar, it makes you look stupid. And you don't want to look stupid. You want to look professional. You want to look smart. And I know you're all smart. So proofread before you hit send. Don't forget your attachments. Like attached here is blah, blah, blah. And then 5 seconds later, oops, here's the attachment, right? You want to avoid that oops email. So what I do when I'm drafting a document with an attachment, I attach first and then write my words later. So that way I always know I do the attachment first, so that it's not like I draft it and hit send and say, oh crap, I forgot the attachment. I attach first. If it's super important, send a written letter and remember to proofread. Let me see if I have other things. Use a cool head. Don't email angry. Don't email drunk. Remember that. Look at your language to see, are you being aggressive in your language? Sometimes you're writing something quickly. If you can't like properly draft it, say you're on your phone, you can say like, sorry, can't properly deal with this. I'll give you a full response when I'm in the office. Use a subject line so that it's easy for the recipient to see, what file is this about? If you have the file name or the file number or specifically what it is, like Jones case discovery, so that the person who's receiving it has an idea of, where it goes to and kind of their priority. I think you guys, I hope we're kind of beyond this, but back when email first came out, many of you are too young to remember, but reply all was like a big problem. So you'd get something and people would like do a little snide comment and they didn't know the difference between reply and reply all, and then the snide comment would go to like everybody in the email list. So that's bad. Watch who you are copying or BCCing. BCCing is a little sneaky, so only do it when it's absolutely necessary. I wouldn't like BCC my client on everything because maybe you don't want them knowing like it just it's kind of lazy. You should be reporting to your client and not just like having them look at everything you send. If there are large attachments, remember people are often working remotely, so watch out for that. Maybe send a link or do a Dropbox or a Google Docs, so that can help people if they're not in the office. Always review. Don't be afraid to call people. You don't always just have to email or text. If there's something that you really need an answer on, sometimes a phone call is really the best way. I mean, this is kind of old stuff too, but make sure you're not in all caps. Don't put little emojis and flowers everywhere. It just doesn't look professional. Okay, so you can be in your tone. You can be friendly. I would be always professional. There are different levels of formal, but be fairly formal. I mean, you can be aggressive if it's need to be, like, but don't as I said, don't email angry, but be professional at all times. So those are kind of your guidelines for ethically and professionally writing your emails. So for that is your written assignment. You're going to have 2 weeks to do it. You're just going to create an email and make sure you kind of check all those boxes. I have the rubric of what is required there. So that's the written assignment. There's a quiz and a discussion board. And I think we have 2 weeks until our next test.
There's no class next week?
No, we have class next week, and then the following week is a test week. So the next week is a regular week, then the week after that is a test week. So that's that. Any questions for me?
Not right now. At some point, I'd like to get with you about having an opportunity to address some of those older assignments I was unable to get to when I was in the hospital.
Yeah. So totally. And I can, when you're ready, you can reach out to me. We can chat offline on another day too. But I have to like reopen some of those quizzes for you. But
yes, please.
yeah. So just let me know what you're, or just send me an email about when you're going to be working on what, and I can open those things for you.
Thank you, Margaret. I sincerely appreciate it.
Oh yeah, no, of course I want you. My goal is for everybody to be successful in this class. So totally with you. All right, gang. I will chat with you next week. Reach out if you need anything from me. Cool beans?
It sounds good. Good night, ladies. You all take care.
Okay, bye, everybody.